On Kyle on the recent terrorist attacks on the U.S. He's joined by former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Senate Minority Leader Trent Lott. Their comments are about a half an hour.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Kyle from Arizona, and I appreciate your being here this morning. I was asked to establish an opportunity for Prime Minister Netanyahu to say a few words and perhaps take some questions before a meeting that he's going to be having with senators of both parties. He was in the House of Representatives last week, testified and met with members of the House of Representatives, and he'll have an opportunity to meet with senators today. I was struck by the fact that as I thought about introducing a real expert on terrorism, a person who's written books about it, who's himself participated in trying to save victims of hostages from terror, and who has dealt with it as the leader of his own country. This morning when I saw on CNN the essence of a debate ensuing as to whether or not there are different kinds of terror and that we should be more accommodating to the terror in Israel than we should be to the terror that was visited to our own shores. And it reminded me that meetings like this are important to understand from people who really understand what the true nature of terrorism is, and to make the point that whether it is visited on the people of Israel or on the people of the United States, there is in essence no difference. And this is especially important as the United States begins to develop policies on how to respond to this terrorism, and beginning, of course, in talking to our democratic ally in the Middle East region, Israel, both to learn from Israel and also to work with Israel. And I hope to make the point that terrorism cannot succeed. In this respect, it is my personal view that it would be folly to make concessions for the Israeli government or the United States government to push for concessions to terrorists who have acted against Israel, simply because that might be a way for us to move forward in our battle. Terrorism begets terrorism, and in my own personal view, one shouldn't differentiate between terrorism visited on Israel versus that visited upon the United States. So these were my thoughts as I thought this morning of how to introduce to you the Prime Minister. I'm going to introduce our leader, the Republican leader. I've also made it clear that our meetings today are bipartisan, and I have simply not been able to reach Majority Leader Daschle this morning. But I know that they both share a very strong desire to continue to work with our ally Israel. And so for the purpose of formally introducing former Prime Minister Netanyahu, I introduce to you the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, Trent Lott.
Well, thank you, John, for the introduction and also for your effort to coordinate this opportunity for senators of both parties to hear from former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I think he'll have a great deal of interest to say to us. In fact, I was just thinking a moment ago, I guess it was about 2 years ago, in this very room. We sat, and some of you came in and took some pictures. I asked some questions as members of the Senate met with Mr. Netanyahu, and we heard from him then about the dangers, the threats that not only Israel faced, but the United States and the world. We took him seriously, but perhaps not as seriously as we should have. I've known him for a long time, going back to when I was in the House of Representatives and in the leadership there, well before he was actually a candidate for office himself. And I've always found him to be very helpful, very informative, a dynamic leader that has done a great deal for Israel, and his leadership in the region has really, truly made a difference. So we are delighted to have him here, and we'll be interested in having his insight as to where we are and what we could expect in the future is going on in the Middle East as a whole. And we will have this closed briefing beginning at 10 o'clock for all senators in a secure area, because we want to make sure that it can be a totally open and candid discussion. So it's a pleasure for me again in this room to introduce my good friend of many years and the former Prime Minister and great leader in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Thank you, Trent. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Lott and Senator Kyle, Senator Hawaii, and good morning to all of you. I think that there is a change in this town that reflects the great hinge of history that has taken place in the bombing of the United States on September 11th. I think the most important thing is to be clear on the conceptions and principles that have to guide us in the great and crucial war that lies ahead. So I look forward to the opportunity to speak in closed chambers with you and your colleagues, because you're the guardians of liberty. At the end of the day, it is the United States that must lead it under President Bush and with the support of the American people as represented by Congress. This is why I attach such great importance to this meeting. I think the President articulated the most fundamental principle, and that is that the battle against terrorism is indivisible. It is indivisible morally, but it is also indivisible in the practical sense, because you cannot make a distinction, and President Bush articulated this exceptionally well. You cannot make a distinction between the terrorist organizations and the terrorist regimes that support them and make their operation possible. If there's one point that I will elaborate in my discussions with the senators, it is that there is no international terrorism without the support of terrorist states, because the terrorists are not floating in midair. They are using the safe havens that are provided on the territory of sovereign states. And those sovereign states are not an infinite number. It is true that there are now terrorist cells throughout Europe and the United States and in many, many other countries. But these terrorist cells by themselves can only operate if they have a home base, an inviolate home base, from which the terror organizations can operate these cells. And the home bases include such regimes as Afghanistan, Taliban Afghanistan. They include Iraq, Iran, Syria, the Sudan, a number of other Middle Eastern countries, and the Palestinian enclave controlled by Yasser Arafat's dictatorship. There you have sundry groups, for example, bin Laden, based until recently in Afghanistan, but shuttling in the last decade between Afghanistan and Khartoum, emerging first out of Saudi Arabia. And you have Hezbollah in Lebanon serving as a training ground for sundry groups in the Syrian-controlled Bekaa. There are a dozen terrorist groups with offices in Damascus. You have, of course, the Islamic Jihad and Hamas and the recently mobilized Tanzim and Fatah factions of Yasser Arafat's regime. All of these groups help one another. All of these regimes help these groups, and they cooperate in a variety of ways, operationally on very many occasions, financially, and also, of course, politically, as we saw in Durban in that previous century, before the bombing. We can see what was happening. Now, I think that it's important to understand that if you dismantle the state support, you dismantle the terrorist network. It cannot survive for very long, and therefore the thrust of the policy should be directed not only at the groups themselves, where I think you should enable the commander-in-chief to take the necessary action and not be ultra litigious, is how I would say it. And I think people today understand Israel's policy of going after people who are coming to kill you. These are not your citizens. These are the nationals of other countries, and you can act and should act. And you probably have to revise your legislation to enable you to act inside the United States. This is a time of war. It's a great crisis. But the crucial thing is you've got to take action against the regimes. You've got to increase deterrence enormously and apply very punishing political, economic, and of course military actions. That is the only thing that will make them rein in and dismantle the terror network. And in fact, stop what they're doing. The only point I would bring to your attention is that Yasser Arafat's regime has been not an incidental part of this network. He has been the copywriter in many ways of the suicide bombings. On the day of the suicide bombings, the day that those planes crashed into the Pentagon in this city and the Twin Towers in New York, Yasser Arafat's mouthpiece, he controls every word in every Palestinian paper, but he has an official mouthpiece called Al-Hayat Al-Jadida. On September 11th, in the morning, Al-Jadida said this: the suicide bombers are the salt of the earth. They are the engines of history. They are the most honorable people among us. This is a regime that glorifies suicide bombings. In Shechem, in Nablus right now, there is a display in which Palestinians are invited to come in. The display is glorifying suicide bombers. You may recall a few weeks ago, the Sbarro restaurant in Jerusalem, a pizzeria, was bombed by suicide bombers. Here's a picture of the entrance to this exhibition, glorifying suicide bombers. You see the Sbarro, the words kasher, kosher in Hebrew, they are replicating the bombing. When you go inside, they show you an oven for pizzas. Senator? They show you an oven for pizzas. There are pizzas inside. There are slabs of human flesh, simulated human flesh, on top of the ovens. People are told that this is the glorified action. Children are encouraged to follow this course. This is taking place right now, under Yasser Arafat's regime, in the areas that he controls, with the protection of his police, with the encouragement of his regime. Summer just ended 3 weeks ago. In the summer, there were summer camps for Palestinian children, kindergarten children, teaching them how to become suicide martyrs. If I can tell you one thing about the terror network, it is this: the success of the terrorists in one place and the terror network breeds, I would say, emboldens terrorists everywhere. So I see a direct line between this kind of terrorism that goes on now. This is now after the bombing. This display, this exhibit is going on now in Yasser Arafat's dictatorship, as we speak. I think that to ask to dilute the principles that were so, I would say, heroically placed by President Bush, by asking Israel to make concessions to this Palestinian regime would be a fundamental mistake for the great war effort that the president has put forward. I think that victory, in this case, as a victory over Nazism, was 60 years ago, 50 years ago, is based on moral clarity, on having a clear principle, not diluting the principle of total opposition to this evil and anyone who participates in it and condones it. Yasser Arafat is not merely condoning it, he's glorifying it. And I think that he should be censured in the starkest terms from the United States and from the United States Senate.
Are you calling on the United States to carry out military action against Yasser Arafat or against Iraq or any other nation state?
I don't think that the U.S., regarding Arafat, I think the crucial question right now is whether we are asked to make concessions to this ghoulish regime, whether there should be a sense that if you attack the United States, then you actually get concessions made to the Palestinians. And in this case, that's an encouragement for more attacks against the United States. I think Kissinger had it right when he said that's the last thing that should be done. The best thing right now is to freeze the situation vis-a-vis as much as possible, but certainly not at the expense of Israel and at the expense of diluting your principle and giving what all the terrorists will see. They know what Arafat is doing. They know they know the suicide bombings that go on there. They know that a woman was murdered this morning by gangs that came from an Israeli woman, 28-year-old woman from a kibbutz, murdered, shot by terrorists coming from the Palestinian areas. So as terror is being conducted and glorified, to ask Israel to make concessions, which is my point here, right now I would say would deeply, deeply hurt the war effort and American interests. As far as the larger question of what do you do with the regimes, there is a combination of efforts that could be done to punish regimes that support and harbor terrorists. And I think the President made that clear, that the U.S. effort would be a broad-based effort that would encompass those regimes. The precise balance of what you do, where you do it, to whom you do it, and what sequence you do it is something that I'm sure is being considered very carefully now in the highest echelons of the American government. Some of these ideas might be discussed with the senators, but I think that the decision obviously should be left to the President, and I'm sure he'll make the right decision.
Wholly responsible for these attacks. Are you saying that Arafat in some way shares some responsibility for this?
No, I think that in the larger sense of things, what you have here is a terror network that sponsors a variety of actions. It doesn't mean, if you have, for example, if you look at piracy in the 19th century, there was piracy around the world, in all the seas. There were pirates in the Mediterranean, there were pirates in the Caribbean. If you had an attack of piracy in the Caribbean, you didn't say, well, I'm only going to deal with that specific attack. When the US, the United States, and Great Britain decided to root out piracy in the 19th century, they said, it is the phenomena of piracy. It is the nature of the act, not only the identity of its perpetrators or not even any justification that they offer that matters. It doesn't matter. What matters is that anybody who practices piracy or harbors pirates is beyond the pale. And they proceeded to adopt a worldwide policy that said piracy is a crime against humanity and pirates are enemies of mankind. And they rooted out piracy in a matter of several years. They were able to do that by going not only after the pirates, but going after the places that allowed them to have safe haven. In the same way, in the 20th century, there was a complete clarity about the evils of Nazism, which were obviously much bigger than those of piracy. And people didn't say, well, maybe some Nazis are okay or some regimes are okay. They went after the whole system. They said Nazism is always evil. We don't care what justifications Hitler offers. We don't care if there were real grievances or imaginary grievances based on evils that were done to Germany in the Versailles Treaty. We go after Nazism. We leave that to the historians. We will not tolerate Nazism. Today, I think the President enunciated a very clear policy. You're either with us or against us. We will not tolerate terrorism. It is always evil. No matter how it's justified, where it's justified, we fight it uniformly. And therefore, the phenomena of terrorism breeds terrorism. I think you said that, Senator, just now. The phenomena of terrorism breeds terrorism. It keeps on fueling it. So you have to go after the whole network that produces terrorism and gives it safe haven and gives it encouragement, political and operational. And you can't just go after the specific organization and even the specific regime that did this horror on September 11th. You might succeed there, but if the network remains intact, you'll have others doing other acts. And indeed, I think if there's one message that I could impart to you today, and I'm certainly going to impart it in our conversations with the Senate, and I tried to do so in my meeting with the members of the House, if you don't do it, then next time you will encounter dangers and horrors that make September 11th look pale by comparison. Today, all crop dusters are grounded in the United States. There's a reason for that. And the reason is that the terrorists, certainly the terrorist regimes today already have, at least 3 of them have chemical and biological weapons. And 2 of them are feverishly working to develop nuclear weapons. And we cannot rule out that these weapons will either fall in the hands of the terror network, or at least some of them, we cannot even rule out that some of them may have already fallen in their hands. And the second thing we cannot rule out is that the system of proxies, using proxies and stealth, might not tempt a regime in the future to launch a covert attack under the cover of apparent unanimity and impunity against the United States or any of its allies. And if, for example, under the first possibility, bin Laden had nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction, do you have any doubt that he would hesitate for a minute to use them? And in the second possibility, we cannot rule out that a state will, a very irresponsible state, might in the future be tempted to, under the cover of anonymity, be tempted to conduct this kind of horror here. So I think that dismantling this terror network is not something that we do merely to safeguard ourselves against the kind of attacks we've experienced today, but far, far greater attacks that all of us could experience tomorrow. And there's a great urgency. And that is why I think the President was absolutely right to call it a war for the protection of our very life, our very societies, our very civilization.
Next question.
Mr. Netanyahu, in a recent interview in a television, you mentioned even though the Muslim countries condemned the terrorist attack, but you don't believe their condemnation is sincere. So are you suggesting to the United States that even though if you're trying to gather more allies, we shouldn't act multilaterally?
Well, first of all, I didn't say that. I didn't say that there are many Muslim countries of whose sincere identification with the United States tragedy is obvious. Turkey is a Muslim country. Some of the Arab regimes, I'm sure, fall in that category of sincerity and so on. Do I believe Yasser Arafat's crocodile tears? I mean, no. It's the highest, probably in the long history of hypocrisy. This man who shed more innocent blood than perhaps any other terrorist leader with the exception of bin Laden, who's bombed American aircraft, who murdered American diplomats like Cleo Noel in Khartoum, who hijacked cruise ships like the Achille Lauro and had an American citizen thrown overboard, a crippled American citizen. This man who, in the Sbarro restaurant, killed American citizens, or I think hurt them just a couple of weeks ago, and who constantly is glorifying the very suicide techniques that killed Americans here. To have this man issue these platitudes about opposing terrorism and to be taken seriously, this is hogwash. I mean, it's absolute hogwash. And I don't think anyone is seriously fooled. And that's what I was talking about. But I think beyond that, the platitudes that would be issued by Iran or by Syria or by Iraq, if they bother at all to issue them, or by Arafat, they are all scrambling in fear. We understand that. But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about a temporary rhetorical backtracking. What we need to do in the first instance, and is the minimal requirement to ascertain whether you're on this side of President Bush's firmly drawn line, with us or against us. Are you with the terrorist or are you against the terrorist? There is no middle ground. Well, the first thing these sponsors and launchers of terrorism have to be asked to do is to dismantle, to crush the terror networks that they operate. That is a prerequisite. It is not a sufficient condition to have them enter into any kind of association or coalition, but it is the necessary minimal condition. And what is that minimal condition? It means that for example, Syria would have to shut down the dozen or so terrorist offices that operate in Damascus, in the Bekaa Valley. It means that you have to dismantle Hezbollah. And it means that Tehran would have to stop this worldwide network of militant Islamic incitement and of course the worldwide terror network that operates alongside with it. It means that Arafat would have to crush Islamic Hamas, crush Hamas, crush the elements in Tanzim and Fatah that are, as we speak, killing innocent people. I think that's what is required. But that is only a prelude, I would say, to a longer view to see whether they have actually changed their policy of espousing terror. So that's what I think we need. I know we're rushed for time, and I don't want to...
question? If they don't, Mr. Prime Minister, if they do not do what you suggest, which you suggest is unlikely, given how much they've invested in building these organizations in the first place, what's the appropriate Western response? Well,
I think that they would stop using terrorism and even stop feeding it if the costs to them were very, very grave indeed. There was a discussion in this city in the 1980s of whether we could stop hijackings, the spate of hijackings, and it was stopped eventually by going not after the terrorists, but going after the regimes that allowed these hijacked planes to go to Algeria and to go elsewhere. I'm not talking about the recent phenomenon of suicidal bombings. I'm talking about the systemic hijackings that were taking place where American and other planes would be hijacked, taken to Algeria, taken to to other places and so on. When you took sanctions to Libya, when you applied very strong sanctions, including military sanctions on states that supported terrorism, that phenomena stopped. Now we have a much bigger task to address, but the principle remains the same. It is applying overwhelming deterrence, that is overwhelming punitive sanctions, including military sanctions, on regimes that continue to harbor and to promote terrorism. And I think that is understood in this town. And perhaps the most important thing, and I'll end with this, is that we have to have moral clarity. We have to say that anybody who engages in the deliberate attack on civilians, the deliberate attack on innocent civilians, which is what terrorism is, as opposed to the unintentional harm done to civilians in legitimate military actions against combatants. Anybody who engages in systemic, deliberate attack on civilians is beyond the pale, and any cause that uses terrorism to advance its purposes or that justifies terrorism is beyond the pale and will be dealt with accordingly. I want to thank you, and I want to thank you, Senators, for giving me this opportunity to speak here today and to speak with you in the coming session that we'll have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Capitol Spotlight is your online multimedia resource focusing on specific legislation on Capitol